Well, good afternoon. Welcome to this newcomer session. My name is Scott Bradner. I'm one of the graybeards of the IETF, as you can tell. There's a few of us graybeards around. This is trying to give you a little bit of information about what the IETF is, what we think we do, how we do it, and what we're here for. So we've got an agenda, a little bit of history, and what we think our purpose is, how work gets done, what you'll see this week in terms of how work gets done, the IETF's role in the world, how it's structured, how its management is selected, and process and procedure of how material gets put out there as standards, typical working group session, and some stuff on intellectual property rights, not because it's wonderful stuff, but you need to know it. Patents are a pain. So, the IETF. IETF doesn't exist. It's not a legal entity. But it was organized and formed in 1986 out of some US government activities that were designed to continue the creation of technology for what was then the ARPANET. The ARPANET was the first of the large-scale packet data networks, packet switching networks, started to be deployed in 1969. But the US government decided it was not a static thing. They wanted to be able to continue development of protocols for it. The biggest protocol that was evolved after 1969 was TCP/IP, which was rolled out in the ARPANET in January of 1983. But these were various government activities. The IETF has been, for most of its early life, completely ignored. And that was great, because we didn't have to answer to anybody. We did what we thought was the right thing to do rather than being told what the right thing to do was, which a lot of standards bodies are in the mode of doing. We're not government approved. We don't have formal government relations officials within the IETF. That is a problem. It's a benefit and a problem. It's not just with governments, but with other standards organizations. The IETF mantra is it's people, not companies. It's people, not organizations. You're here representing yourself and what knowledge you have and what capabilities you have. The fact you work for a particular company or a particular organization is irrelevant. If somebody gets up to a microphone in an IETF meeting and says, "I'm here from Cisco," and Cisco thinks, he will be laughed at, because everybody knows that Cisco doesn't think. Companies don't think, people think. So you're here as individuals. You may have a lot of baggage with you, but you're here as individuals. And it's your own capabilities and intellect and knowledge and technical ability is what counts, not where you're from, not what name is on your badge. It's really, it's a meritocracy. That can be very frustrating, particularly for folks that are coming from government entities or from other standards bodies. Because when they're speaking, they're not just speaking for themselves, they're speaking for a large group, sometimes a great deal of technical effort, particularly from a standards body. But we can't tell, there's no way for us to judge the quality of that thinking. So it's really, we have to look at what the knowledge, the comments that are made, we have to look at that directly and judge what we think based on what that said. So that's an advantage because we're getting the best technical stuff out. It's a disadvantage because there are times when we can really learn from what government representatives say or a standards body representatives say, but we just don't know how to do that. And you may run into that from time to time this week. So we're not government approved. There's no governments that approve our output. There's no formal role for governments. We were funded by the US government up until 1997, at least the Secretariat was. The primary, you'll see later on, the primary funding for the IETF is the organizations that the people who come here and participate in it belong to. Harvard pays some of my time, gives me my time to do work on this. Other companies pay for their time and expenses. And we reject kings, presidents, and voting. We believe in rough consensus and running code. And I'll go through each of those things in sequence as we get to them. So, IETF overview. We do internet standards. Not all internet standards, but most of the internet standards, most of the plumbing standards we do. We've got some surface things like the page descriptor language, HTML, that's done by W3C. We've got things like the Ethernet standard, or the ATM standard, or how you put photons on fiber. That's not us, that's IEEE or ITU, it's other organizations. We do the stuff in the middle, which is the internet, the network of networks, technology to support the network of networks. We don't legally exist. It's just an organized activity of the Internet Society. The Internet Society is a legal entity, but the IETF isn't by itself a legal entity. It's just a process as much as anything else. We have somewhere between 1,000 and 1,500 people at meetings. There were 1,335, I think, people pre-registered for this meeting, which is bigger than most. It was a surprise. Here's the chart of time over time. We started out at 21 attendees at a company called Linkabit in San Diego. 4 of those 21 people are still active in the IETF. I've seen one so far today, and I expect to see 3 others, the other 3, during this week. So that's a good percentage-wise. People have been there from the very beginning. We peaked in the middle of the internet boom of 2800. That was a pretty heady time. It was a pretty crowded meeting rooms, but it dropped off quite quickly when the internet boom died. So it goes. And as you can see, we've been oscillating back and forth between 1,000 and 1,500 since. And I expect we'll be at the higher end of that range this week. What's our purpose? Purpose is to develop and maintain standards and technologies used to provide internet service and used to provide services over the internet. So the internet service itself, internet service providers, its routing, transport, things on that level, but also applications that are providing services such as streaming audio, streaming video, things like that. We want to make sure that the technology can perform the functions that it needs to. To do that, we have to understand what those functions are. We have to understand what the actual requirements are for a technology before we can standardize it. We make sure that it can support it at scale. The internet is one of those things that the concept of going viral is not a new one in the internet. It's new in the sense that that's YouTube or Twitter or something. But for the history of the internet, back into the mid-90s, which it goes much further back, but that's when the web started and when people the general population started using it. You'd go from unknown to 1 million hits a day overnight. In 2 days, you'd be doing that. And so your systems and your technologies have to be at scale to that level very quickly. Can't fall over just because you're a success. Death by success is not an option. We've got to do better than that. Make sure the technology is secure. This is even more true in the last few years since the Snowden revelations. The IETF got pretty jazzed up about the Snowden revelations, and you will see that the IAB put out a RFC which equated pervasive surveillance with an attack. It's an attack on the population of the internet. And so the IETF is spending quite a bit of time trying to ensure that the internet itself is resistant to that kind of attack. So encryption by default and things like that. You want to also, it might help to be able to manage the stuff. If you deploy it, but you can't manage it, then it's not going to be much use. So it has to be manageable. And we produce standards, plus other documents. Well, what's a standard? Quite a few years ago, back in the mid-90s, when the ITU, International Telecommunication Union, was just beginning to understand there was this internet thing out there, but really it wasn't really up on what it was. I was the liaison between the IETF and the ITU, And I went over to Geneva for a meeting. There was no internet connectivity in the building. You could dial out to an internet service provider. That's all you could do. It was a modem room in the basement you could dial out from. So the then head of the IAB and I gave a presentation after hours on what IETF was and what the internet was. And we had 500 or 600 people in this room, and it was after hours, so it was pretty dedicated. The very first question I was asked when we were finished our presentation, which was somewhat similar to this one, was how can you call your things standards if no government mandates their use? Well, that's a different concept of standard than we've got. Our concept of standard is we put it out there, we call it a standard because it's gone through the right sequence of processing to get it to be defined as a standard. But that standard is irrelevant unless people use it. Where there's no mandatory use, we don't have any protocol police which is telling you what to do and what not to do, unlike some governments which have regulations saying you must use this standard or not. We don't do any of that sort of stuff. Our standards are only useful standards if you and others decide to use them. So that's our definition of standard is it's gone through the process, but then somebody actually uses it. We publish our standards as RFCs. We'll talk more about RFCs in a bit. There's no formal recognition for IETF standards. Some requests for quotes or regulatory requirements do refer to them, but we don't have any. There's very few that do that, because if we don't exist, then how can they refer to our standards as something that's meaningful? And it's a catch-22 there. It's a difficult thing to do. The lack of formal government approval is a problem in some areas. There are parts of Europe which cannot, by regulation, refer to IETF standards, because we don't meet their definition of a standards body. But we don't submit our standards to anybody else to approve. They're just done. When we're done with them, they're done, and you either use them or you don't. The work in the IETF is done in working groups. At the time I made up these slides, there were 128 working groups. Some have, I think a couple have been finished off and disbanded since then, and a couple may have been added. So that's why the ish, because we're not sure exactly how many, but that's how many there were when we were doing this. The personnel here is that there's a working group chair. Working group chair directs the activities of a working group and determines the level of consensus about the issues that are brought in front of the working group. A working group chair is a decider. Decides when consensus has been met, has been reached, and between multiple technical proposals, decides what the consensus is relative to those proposals. Within a working group, there may be a document editor. In general, the working group chair is not the document editor, because then the working group chair can't make an unbiased judgment on the quality of the work. So the working group, the document editor is somebody different than the working group chair, in most cases. Occasionally that's not the case, but most of the case it is. They edit individual documents. The editing is exactly that, it's editing. It's not authoring in the sense of it's your document. You are supposed to be reflecting, if you're a document editor, you're supposed to be reflecting the consensus of the working group. And in fact, we've had situations, when I was an area director for quite a while, and I had situations where the document editor was not reflecting the working group consensus, and we had to fire the editor and give the document to somebody else. That's a very messy and ugly situation. You don't want to get into it, but it does happen. The working groups are collected together into areas, mostly for managerial efficiency. Something in one area, there's overlap between what working groups are in what areas. That something that should be in the applications area was in the transport area when I was transport AD, just because I liked the topic, and the applications area director didn't. But it could have gone either way. So it's a fuzzy arrangement. Some of the working groups are pretty clear, like security-related ones are in the security area. But most of the rest are sort of fuzzy as to what their boundaries are. Those are the current areas, 8 areas. Each area has one or more area directors, which is guiding the general work of the area, helping decide when working groups should be formed or disbanded, helping decide on what the working group charters are and the working group chairs are. There's a IETF chair. The title is IETF chair, and generally it's the spokespot for the IETF in general. Doesn't have any greater or less technical authority than any other person in the IETF. The chair can go into a working group and say, I think this, and the working group can say, fine, but we don't think so. He doesn't have any particular authority that way. The area directors meeting as a body with the IETF chair form the IESG, Internet Engineering Steering Group. The IESG is the body within the IETF that makes the decision on when something's a standard. They're the deciding body. They do a technical review of the proposals, and if they think the proposal meets snuff, is good enough, has all the problems resolved, and they check to see the consensus was reached, then they would approve it as on the standards track or informational, whatever other type of document. There's also an Internet Architecture Board, that's the IAB, and they provide general architectural guidance. So a little bit of background here that might be amusing. In 1992, or actually 1991, the IAB made some pronouncements of the future of the internet without consulting the IETF general populace. The general populace didn't like this very much and rebelled and basically did a palace coup. At that time, the IAB was the decision body. They were the ones that decide whether something was going to be a standard or not. Well, there was a working group formed, the Poisson working group, that looked into this and decided to reorganize the IETF. And it kicked the IAB out of authority, put the IESG in place of it, and told the IAB that it was guidance, not decision anymore. And it moved from the it's now in that role of an advisory body rather than the decision body. And we did that through an IETF working group. So we do working groups not only for technology, but for our own processes as well. Area directors, each area has 1, 2, or 3 area directors. This used to say, as of a few weeks ago, it said 2 area directors, except for the general area, which has 1, which is the IETF chair. But the IESG has reorganized in the last few months and has munged things together, and is experimenting with different ways to organize the working groups within areas. And so right at the moment, it's a little fuzzy as to how many area directors are in a particular area. The general area has 1, and one of the other technical area has 1, and then some of the others have 3. Most of them have 2. And they're the people that are responsible for creating working groups, disbanding working group charters, making sure the working group is generally doing its job. If not, then they go have a discussion with their working group chairs to get it to work. They also do a technical review of any proposals that come up from working groups. So the area directors is an important role. It has a technical role because they have to evaluate the technology that's being proposed for a standards track or from informational. And then they also have to be managerial in that they're managing all this efforts. And the IESG, as I already mentioned, is the deciding body. It is cross-area technical review. This is one of the things that's fundamentally different about the IETF than many other standards bodies. A lot of other standards bodies, the work of the developing a standard takes place in a working group or a study group or a rapporteurs group in a small technical group with people who are focused on that particular technology topic. Once it's done in there, all of the rest of the steps in the process are process steps. Did you send out the right ballot? Did you do this? Did you do that? But they're not evaluative. They don't go in and evaluate the technology in those higher level steps. They just make sure that the processes are followed. The IETF does it differently. When a working group finishes a proposal, hands it up to the IESG through their area director. Area director first reviews it to see whether it makes technical sense. and whether it makes linguistic sense, just to whether the thing makes any sense at all. Can you read it and understand it? If you can read it if the area director thinks you can read and understand it, then it goes up to the IESG. The IESG then does a cross-area technical review. Each of the IESG members is from a different technical area: security, routing, transport, whatever, real-time activities, all of those different areas. They all evaluate the same documents. So it comes up, the working group doesn't have any security expertise, it gets to the IESG, the security area director says, the area directors say, this is not going to fly because it doesn't have enough security. Or the operational area directors look at it and say, you can't actually run this thing. It's too complicated. So it gets kicked back down to the working group to work on it some more. So we have this cross-area technical review in the IESG process. Whoops. Apple is telling me something I didn't want to know, but that's Apple for you. So does cross-area review, and if it's like it, then it passes. And I'll go into a little bit more how that process works in a bit. The IESG manages the general process of the IETF, approves working groups and things like that. So how does it actually get done? How does the work get done? Almost all, but not all, standards come out of working groups. The working group does the thinking about a standard. Somebody might propose a document, and the document as proposed is in the form of what is called an internet draft, and the working group reviews it and iterates on it, so that successive generations of internet drafts. The BGP update took 26 iterations of the draft to get it right. And that was mostly because the technology kept changing and kept finding bugs they had to fix, and had to fix the technology as it went along. So these working group documents, the internet drafts, mostly are done by people, the document editors within the context of a working group and at the direction of the working group itself. So the editor is supposed to be reflecting the working group consensus. It's revision and after revision, and then when the working group believes it's ready, it then kicks it up to the area director reviews it, and if the area director likes it, it kicks it to the rest of the IESG, and the rest of the IESG reviews it at that point. But the rest of the IESG doesn't review it immediately. The first thing that the rest of the IESG does is send out what is called a last call, an IETF-wide last call. And this is to anybody that's on the IETF announced list and people in other standards bodies who are subscribed to a mailing list that we maintain. That anybody can comment on this. Anybody outside, the idea here is to get people outside of the expertise of the local people, the people that develop the standards. You may know something that the people who developed the standard didn't know. And we very, very frequently have something where somebody with some niche of expertise will look at a proposal and say, this is broken because of X, because this won't work because of this thing they didn't know and they didn't think of. So it has to go through that process. Once it's gone through the last call process, and the IESG evaluates the results of the last call and their own cross-area technical review, and either kicks it back to the working group for more work or sets it up for publication. Oh yes, one thing I forgot to mention in the previous thing I said, that most but not all standards come from working groups. You can write your own. If you come up with this phenomenal idea for a pinochle playing protocol, you can write it up, and if you write it up, you publish as an internet draft. We'll talk about internet drafts in a bit. Publish an internet draft, you circulate it, you tell people on the IETF list about it, and they get excited about it, they read it, they offer suggestions, you modify it. No working groups involved, it's just you doing it. And you keep doing that, and then when you think it's ready, you go around, shop it to various area directors and say, I think this is ready to be a standard. And if you've got an area director that believes in it, they can pick it up and work through that process. Same process, it goes to an IETF working group, it goes to an IETF last call, and then cross-area technical review and all of that. The one difference is that for a working group document, it's a 2-week last call. IESG sends out a last call saying, tell us within 2 weeks, what do you think? For an individual submission, it's 4 weeks. So it's going to take you 4 weeks to get that pinochle playing protocol through. But you can still do it. There's not a requirement to go through a working group. It's just generally done that way. Most working groups, but not all, started with a birds of a feather session. Birds of a feather session don't need to create working groups. They can be simply informational. When I was area director for transport, we had a number of birds of a feather sessions, or called BOFs, which were simply informational to provide context for the IETF about some issue. We did one on quality of service over the internet. Didn't lead to a working group. It led to just more information about what could be done and what the expectations were. We had somebody had brought in people from big banks and from big companies and from little researchers to tell us what they would like to see in an internet that they could control the quality on. We had all kinds of input from various people, and the most memorable was a guy from FedEx said that what he wants out of the internet is McDonald's. He wants the same crappy burger no matter where he goes. He wants predictability. Exactly the same, no matter where he is in the world, he gets a McDonald's burger, he gets the same thing. He wants out of the internet, no matter what day it is, no matter what time of day it is, he gets the same quality of service. He gets the same user experience. That was a memorable way to put it. Of course, that's from a company whose business is doing something other than what everybody else does, delivering faster and more expensively. So working groups, BOF can create a working group, it doesn't always. The BOFs this week, I think most of them are set up for trying to create a working group. Well, that's cute. So one of the things a BOF is for is to allow the area director to decide whether there's enough interest in the topic and enough support for the topic that a working group would be successful. There are enough worker bees to work on it. I remember one time when I was area director, we did a BOF. There was 300 people in the room or something. It was a popular topic. At the end, I got up and I said, okay, show of hands. How many people think this should be an IETF working group? And about half the people put up their hands. You will see this week that that's actually a very good turnout. Most of the time, it's a very small fraction of the people in the room express an opinion. So then I asked a reverse question. How many people think this should not be an IETF working group? And about half the people put up their hands. Well, that led me to believe there wasn't consensus, even rough consensus, that this should be a working group. So it did not become a working group. At that point, it did a few years later when there was more consensus on what it should be doing. So the BOF is trying to understand whether it's ready for prime time, ready to be worked on. Sometimes the BOF will result in, this is still research. We don't know how to do this. The technology is not yet developed enough, in which case the IRTF, I'll talk about that in a bit, the IRTF is the proper place for it. We only put things in the IETF working groups which we know we can standardize. We know enough about the technology, it's ready for actual deployment, it's ready for actual development. Most of the work is done in working groups, a few offhand individuals, most of the work is done in working groups. The face-to-face meetings, like this week, are short and have to be to the point. In many standards bodies, a working group meets in a face-to-face way for a week to 2 weeks at a time. That's not the way it works here. An average session is between an hour and 2.5 hours. Occasionally, a working group will have more than one session in a week. That's not enough time to write the document in real time. The document is written using the mailing list. Succession of internet drafts, commentary on the mailing list. What goes on at this week, goes on in an IETF meeting, is people getting together to worry about the high order issues that weren't resolved in the mailing list. Should the bits be in this order or that order? That's a discussion you have in the working group session. You won't get a discussion of the overall technology because it's the specific point. specific open issues is what's going to be discussed. There, as I say, the meetings are quite short, an hour to 2.5 hours. You can't do a lot in that period of time in terms of actually generating a document. Some of the working groups do have a section of their meetings where people propose new activities for the working group. And you'll see some of that this week. Almost always, IETF working groups come from the bottoms up. A number of people get together and say, this is something we would like to work on. We have an idea here. They write an internet draft. They publish the internet draft under their own name, not under working group name, under their own name. And they say, here it is, let's talk about it. Let's have a BOF about it. There's something here we can talk about. And from that grows a working group. So you don't need a BOF to generate a working group. An area director can do that just by looking at the document and seeing the discussion of mailing lists and say, okay, I'm going to make a working group. But most of the time it goes through this process of doing a BOF. Very occasionally, an area director will go and pick some people and say, we need this technology, we need you to, and you're good people to work on it. Get somebody to go write an internet draft and do it from the top. Very, very rarely. Happens like once in a year, once in 2 years. Almost all of this stuff's from the bottoms up. And what that means is the IETF can't promise anything. Can't go into a meeting with other standards bodies and say, okay, we'll do that. The IETF doesn't know whether they've got the worker bees that are interested. If they don't have the people that are interested, they're not going to do it. So we can't promise anything. And that's a very difficult situation when meeting with governments or meeting with other standards bodies. They say, well, can the IETF come up with a standard for that? I don't know. We don't know until we try, until we get the right set of people who are interested in trying. Working groups are governed by charters. Charters worked out between the working group and the working group chairs and the IESG and the IAB, with the final say being the IESG. And it's a contract. It says, here's the things you're going to work on. It will frequently say, here are the things you're not going to work on. But the basic rule is, if it's not in the charter, then you're not working on it. And you will hear occasionally this week of somebody coming up to the mic after somebody's proposed something and say, that's not in the charter. You're not supposed to be doing this. We're trying to, by using that mechanism, having a charter like that, we're trying to focus the working group on the work they need to get done, rather than going off on various excursions into various other things. We want them to work on the things that we want them to work on, and what they agreed to work on. And in theory, and more often than not, when a working group gets its job done, publishes its documents, it's disbanded. There's no need for it anymore once it's done. Now, this is a great shock to some people. Most standards groups, you become a working group chair, and that you were rewarded. If you do a good job, you're rewarded and you get another working group, or you get this working group continued with a new charter. We don't generally do that. I remember at one point when one of my working groups did a wonderful job, got everything done, and I called up the chair and said, great job, we can disband the working group now. And he was pretty upset, because he came from a different standards body, a different organizational mentality, where he thought that because he got the stuff done, he'd be given more to do. And no, you have to go back to ground zero, and if you have another proposal, then that's great. You can work it through the same process. So some working groups are long-lived. One of the working groups that's here, that's meeting this week, is DHC, Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol, which is the very first working group that I actually personally attended in Tallahassee in 1990. It's the first meeting, the physical meeting I walked into was that particular working group. That's still going on. Because there's still options that you want to add to Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol. But most working groups tend to fade out and go away. So there's a visual of what I've talked about. Might have a BOF. Chair works up a charter with the get a chair, just come up with a charter, get a process in place, make sure the working group's there, the worker bees are there. Area director looks at it. If the area director agrees, pops it up to the ISG, which then ask the IAB for their advice. It would also ask this new work list. New work list is a mailing list we maintain between different standards bodies. Any standards body can subscribe to this. And so we set up saying, we're about to work on this new topic, and here's its charter. What do you think? And that's specifically there so another standards body can say, whoops, I'm already working on that. We're already working on it over here. You don't need to do it, or we want you to work together with us, or liaison with us, or do something, but don't ignore us. And we get that occasionally. But truth to be said, the reaction time is not quite right for most standards bodies. We put out this note that says, IESG is considering this new working group. Please let us know within 2 weeks whether it's okay, whether you have any questions. And most standards bodies can't say hello in 2 weeks. They don't know how to do that process-wise. They don't have any way to do that. So we do occasionally get wait a second, I got to talk to folks about this, hold on. But most of the time, we don't get a lot of response because it's too fast to return time. So working group session, what you'll see this week, is, as I said, only a few hours, so it's focused on the big things, specific unresolved issues, things like that. You'll have microphones like this in the middle of the room. This is a room that will be used for working group sessions this week. And you'll see this little tag on the microphone, little sign on the microphone. That is to remind you to state your name every time you get to the microphone. You may have been there 1 minute before, but the people out there in audio land don't know that. And the person taking the minutes doesn't know that. So every single time you get to the microphone, say your name. And the other thing is talk to the microphone. Don't talk to the guy that asked you the question. Talk to the microphone. It's amazing how poor geeks are dealing with microphones. They throw over here and they talk over here, and microphone's over here. You've got to pretend to love the microphone. Get really close to it. Really like the microphone. But talk to the microphone. Don't talk to your friend. Don't talk around it. Talk to the microphone. And close. If you're tall, lean down. If you're short, bend the microphone down. But get to the microphone. I emphasize that because it's so poorly adhered to. It should be an easy concept. You know, voice is well known. You are welcome. You're new here. Fine. Some of you have been to more than one IETF meeting and just coming for the abuse in this session. But if you have something to say, say it. Just because you're new doesn't mean you don't have something to say. But read the documents. Understand what the issues are. Don't make everybody understand that you're a fool. Make sure that you actually have something useful to say when you say it. But don't hesitate if you do have something. That's why you're here, is to participate, to help us create better standards. And you only do that if you speak up. There is blue sheets for all sessions, not this one because it's not a formal standards session, but there's what are called blue sheets because they're blue paper, and they're to record who is in the room. Part of the openness you need to do if you're a standards body, not just the Internet standards body, every standards body, you need a record of who was participating in the process. We maintain mailing list archives so you can see who sent messages on the mailing list. We maintain these archives of people who are in the room. So when the blue sheet comes around to you, it'll be passed around on a clipboard. Sign it as legibly as you can. And put down just what it asks for, which is your affiliation. It does not ask for your email address. We're not going to create a spam list. We want to record of who is there. Those blue sheets are now scanned and posted and then destroyed. In the olden days, we did used to ask for email addresses. And in order to not create spam lists, there was a time when we were publishing this part of the proceedings, including email addresses and all, and that was scraped to be spam lists. So for a while, we did the blue sheets and archived them in a warehouse in Western Virginia. And every now and again, we get a request from some lawyers saying we want to know who was in the room for that meeting. So you have to go out, send somebody out to the warehouse and go find the right one and copy it and send it on off. we don't want to do that anymore, so which is why we publish them. But do sign the blue sheets. It's important. This week, there's, try this again. This week, the 127 sessions, actually now it's 120, it's actually less than that. And when I made up the slide, there were 127 sessions. There have been at least 3 cancellations since then. So there's 3 less. 112, or actually a little less than 112 unique sessions, 7 BOSS, 7 IETF sessions. There's a technical plenary on Monday. This is from the earlier agenda. It is no longer, the ITU penny pot is no longer, the high-level summary of that is no longer on the agenda. I don't know what happened to it, but it's no longer on the agenda as of this morning. But there is a IP stack evolution. And then there's an operations and administrative plenary on Wednesday. Those are interesting to go to as newcomers. The technical plenary tries to bring up some technical issues and have a discussion about them and trying to inform the community about some technical situation. Bruce Schneier did a speech in the technical plenary relatively short after the Snowden revelations on how important it was for the IETF to try and create a secure internet. And that was a pretty invigorating speech. He was pretty directive at what he thought we should do. This time it's more on some specific technical issues and ones which you may find pretty interesting. The Operations Administration Plenary is more in line with the reports. There's a report from the IETF chair that says what the distribution of people at the meeting are, how many from what country, things like that. So a general architectural distribution of that. Sometimes announcements of upcoming meetings and things like that. Reports from various managers, like the RFC editor manager is going to report. And then there's an open mic session on Monday at the technical plenary for the IAB, where anybody can ask the IAB anything they want to. And the IAB is supposed to answer it. Some may generally answer okay, but not always. And then on the Wednesday plenary, there's 2 open mics, one with the IAOC, which I'll talk about in a minute, which is the business managers for the IETF, and the other is for the IESG, which we've talked about already. And then on Thursday evening, there's what is called a bits and bytes. It's companies buy tables to display their wares, display what they're doing technology-wise, and in order to encourage people to come, there's free booze, wine and beer, and free snacks. And so it's definitely worth the price of admission, even if you don't do anything but just drink the beer and eat the snacks. Dave Clark's mention there of rough consensus. We believe in rough consensus and running code. Rough consensus is a pretty important feature of the IETF. We do not require unanimity. We don't require everybody to like it. If you propose something and 10% of the people in the room think that's a terrible idea and 90% think it's a great idea, it'll proceed. Don't have to satisfy everybody. Many standards bodies require unanimity. They require what Margaret Thatcher once said was that consensus is when everybody is equally dissatisfied. Well, we don't require that. You can have some very dissatisfied people, but we're going to move on. We're not going to be stuck by a few people not thinking this is the right path. You're supposed to listen to them, air their ideas, to make sure we understand why they're against this particular proposal. But in the end, it's the rough consensus. Now, what level of consensus? That depends on the situation. If it's a question that makes no technical difference, it's on, let's say, the bit order on a wire, and the argument is aesthetics, then it can be a pretty rough consensus. So, 75% people can say one way and 25% the other, and we'll still move ahead. If it's something where there's a real technical choice, then you need much higher level of consensus, but you never need 100%. Frequently get it, but you don't need it. And this means that we can move forward in the face of a few people objecting. That it allows things to go much faster. It also allows the fact that if, let's say, you're saying, I'm not going to support this unless you put in my silly idea. Now, I'm sure you don't have any silly ideas, but let's just take that for an example. You have a silly idea. The rest of the working group can look at it and say, that's a silly idea. We're not going to put it in. In many standards bodies, they'd have to put it in to satisfy you to get you to agree. We don't do that, which means our standards tend to be a little simpler, a little less gewgaws, a little less cruft on them. They're not perfect, but there's a little less of that, and that helps. We don't do voting. We can't do voting. We don't have any constituency. We don't have any members. We don't legally exist. We don't have any members. We do a consensus. We get an understanding consensus. In a room, we do that a couple of different ways. On a mailing list, we do that by just watching the traffic. That's a very hard thing to do, by the way, understanding consensus on a mailing list, because one fast typist with an agenda can destroy the mailing list, can wipe that out. But in the room, at least you can get the general idea. So let's try that here. I've got a simple case, which is, how many people travel more than 300 miles to get here today? Show of hands. How many people travel less than 300 miles to get here? So the rough consensus is an IETF meeting is more than 300 miles away. That's how we determine it. Notice I didn't count it. I looked at the general tenure of the room. If somebody's counting hands, then they're not getting the point. The point is whether it's obvious to just an observer. But let's take a special case. So you think the right answer is A. Your boss, who is sitting over there, thinks the right answer is B. Now, are you going to stick up your hand with it for A? Well, it might be a tough time back at the old factory, so maybe you don't want to do that. So we have a different method of gauging consensus, and that's a hum. We've been derided for doing this, but it does work. So hum if it took you more than 300 miles to get here. Hum if it was less than 300 miles. So we know it was more than 300 miles, but we have no idea who said what. So your job is safe. So you'll see that. You'll see both of those used. The idea is to see whether there's an overwhelming feeling in the room in one direction or another. Trying to gauge the rough consensus. Not unanimity, but rough consensus. Whatever is gauged in the room is not final until it's ratified in the mailing list. Because there's a lot of full-time IETF participants who never come to a meeting. They can't afford to. They're students. They've got real day jobs they can't afford to get away from. So they're working entirely from home or from their office. IETF documents. All IETF documents are open. Any working group documents, any resultant standards, they're all open. Anybody can copy them. Anybody can reproduce them, and that's fine. In the early days of the IETF, a company called SRI used to take copies of RFCs, package them up in books, and sell them. Sell them to libraries, because libraries needed real tangible things. They needed real physical books. Nobody else did, because you could just download it from the ARPANET. You can get it for free over the ARPANET. But the fact they were doing that was just fine. They were making money on it. Cool, that's fine, no problem. We've seen a few cases of that more recently, but they're all open there for everybody to do whatever they want with them, as long as they treat them entirely as is. You can take any IETF document and translate it into any language you want to. That's a blanket permission. What you can't do is take it, modify it, and then claim it's your own. Or modify it, republish it, and claim it's the original. We don't have the right to produce derivative works other than translations. That's not part of it. But they're open other than that. Many standards bodies don't let you get a hold of the working group documents because it's a mechanism by which they are getting you to join the company, join the standards group. If you're not a member of the standards group, you can't see the working documents, so therefore you can't affect them. Well, our documents are all open. Anybody can get them and work on them. RFCs are the archival publications. Once they're published, they're never changed. If you got RFC XYZ, it's the same one that was published 10 years ago. The same text. If we need an update, we do that by publishing another RFC with another number. This is different than, for example, Ethernet. If you go get the Ethernet standard today is very different than the Ethernet standard was 20 years ago. The document's called the same thing, but it's a different document. It's internally different. That's not the way we work. It's the same thing. Our language is English. You are permitted to translate in anything you want, of course. But the official language is English. Up until very recently, everything was in ASCII, plain, ordinary, printable characters. No accent acutes or anything else. It was simply ASCII. That's changing. It's now been formally adopted that we can have a fancier XML-based standard, which allows you to get better things. We were getting a lot of derision about being ASCII only because you couldn't draw pictures. Well, actually you can. There's something called ASCII art, which you draw pictures using vertical bars and minus signs and left arrows, and you got to have really good drugs to do some of that art. Some of that art is absolutely amazing, but it's not something that's easy to do, and it doesn't read all that well. It's pretty hard to read. So now we can have better pictures, but the archival version is still going to be a text-based version. It has the XML-based, but it's a text-based version. We can still read the RFCs we did in 1969. And how many standards bodies can say that when they used Word, which now has 3 generations of incompatible generations of Word since then. So we were tardy, but we're consistent. Internet draft, that's the initial document. That's anybody's thoughts. There is no barrier to publication for internet drafts other than that you agree to our intellectual property rules. Everything else is anybody can publish anything they want to. And if you look at the internet drafts, you will see that anybody can publish anything they want to. There's some very, very strange documents out there. Ones that I certainly wouldn't want to put my name on. But they're input to the process. Sometimes they're just informational, just for information of the community. It's a company publishing their own internal technology standards. And that's fine. We don't claim any ownership over it. Unless it's put into a working group, then it's simply your own ego, publishing it for your own ego. You don't get much publication credit because it's not even peer reviewed. It's just computer reviewed to make sure it's in the right format and has the right boilerplate on it. All RFCs must pre-exist as internet drafts. That's in order to meet some of the IPR issues. And we'll talk about IPR issues in a bit. Except for some particular IANA-based or RFC editor-based RFCs, and I'll talk about them in a bit. Internet drafts have names, and you can tell a little bit about the status of them just by looking at the file name. All of the file names begin with draft dash. The ones that are IETF working groups then have IETF, so draft dash IETF, followed by a working group name. The ones that are individuals are draft dash the author's last name, followed by some other information like what the topic is. Ends with a version number and a .txt, so it's in text form. It's ASCII text. Some examples of that. This is BGP 4-26. That is an IETF working group, IDR, the Interdomain Routing Working Group. But there were 26 versions of that before it became an RFC. It took a lot of iterations. Bradner RFC 3979 BIS-06, that's the 6th edition, 6th revision of a update of the IETF's intellectual property rights rules that I've written. IAB RFC format requirements -03, this was a document from the IAB saying, how do we move away from purely text RFCs? That's what led us to the XML-based RFCs. What is an RFC? Well, it used to stand for request for comments. In their very early days, they were that. You publish it, and people would comment on it, and they'd publish another one. That role has been taken up by internet drafts. So an RFC is an RFC. It is not a request for comments. It's a brand name. It's a trademark or something, but we didn't trademark it because too many other people use it. But it is not meant to be a request for comments. So if you see somebody like in a news article saying, RFC mumble, 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 that's request for comments, mumble, 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 you know they don't understand the IETF. It's an RFC, that's all it is. By the time it gets to be an RFC, it's too late to comment on it. So we're certainly not going to call it request for comments. No, we're over 7,000 RFCs. I don't know exactly how many. You look at the index, you can see what the biggest number is, but many of the RFCs in the early days didn't get published. They were promised to be published, and somebody promised to deliver something, so a number was set aside for them, but they were never actually published. So there's gaps, and I don't know how many gaps there are. So there's over 7,000 RFCs. When I started, my first RFC is RFC 1244. So it goes back quite a ways. Not all RFCs are standards. Sometimes you'll see, particularly press releases from companies saying, this is an IETF RFC, so now it's a standard. And really all it is somebody's private musings. A company publishing their internal documentation as RFCs, which we do, because it can be useful to the community, but it's not a standard. There's been no IETF review of it, it was just published. So here's a bunch of the types. We've got standards track, obsolete, requirements, documents, policies, poetry, Vint Cerf writing a poem, white papers asking for information, corporate documentation, history, process documents like the IETF standards process itself is RFCs. And then the one that people like mostly is the April Fool's Day RFCs. April Fool's Day RFCs are ones that look like real technical documents, but there's something wrong. The first one was the Telnet randomly lose option. Turn this option on, it would randomly lose characters. John Postel published this. It was I forget who it was from, but no one really knows why he decided to publish it other than it was a hoot. It was fun. And it looked exactly like the real thing. It just wasn't something you would generally implement, but it was there. I have a couple of, actually 3 or 4 in that series now. One of them was the omniscience protocol requirements. And that's after a US Senator, Orrin Hatch, said that he wanted to be able to really destroy them. Well, if you're going to do that, you have to know that that music is on there illegally. So you have to be omniscient. You can't do this just by guessing. You have to know for sure. So I have a whole series of requirements for this omniscience protocol. It's got to work when your computer's not connected, so it has to use wormhole routing, and it's got to do all kinds of stuff. And it got published on April 1st, 1 year, and I got completely trashed for it, because about half the people that read it thought it was me being serious and supporting Orrin Hatch. That's colloquially was going in bed with Orrin Hatch, which is an image I did not want to have. But they, so Slashdot thought I was serious about it and just trashed me something awful, which was perfect. Because if you do it right, they think it's real. Some will get the joke. They'll look at the publication date and get the joke, but others won't, and that's perfect. Another one I had was a firewall enhancement protocol, which is you put all of TCP/IP over HTTP to get through those pesky firewalls that only let port 80 through. And again, half the mail I got was asking for implementations. There have been implementations. But so you'll see it's coming up on April Fool's Day. We may or may not. That's up to the RFC editor, the independent stream editor, whether there's a document that's good enough to be published as this. We don't know yet this year whether there's going to be any. This slide is here because many people have heard that the IETF has a 3-stage standards process. It no longer does. It's a 2-stage. We have a separate series of standards called best current practices, which is what for example, the standards process itself is documented as a BCP, best current practice. Otherwise, we have two-step standards track, technical standards track. This is what is called a proposed standard. Now, that doesn't mean it's proposed as a standard. It is a standard at the proposed level. It is something which is equivalent to the output of most standards bodies. It is something that is, as far as we know, completely right. All of the problems have been examined and resolved. There may not be any implementations. There might be, but there may not be. And that's the output of most standards bodies in that form. You don't have to actually build anything to actually put out a standard. So proposed standard is in that level. And if you get multiple interoperable implementations, then you can move up to the full standard level. Now, I say this goes back to Dave Clark's rough consensus and running code. Running code is there. If you get multiple interoperable implementations starting from different implementations, then what do you know? Most people look at it and say, oh, well, that means it's popular. Multiple people implemented it. That's actually not our concern. Our concern is that you implementing it from the specification and you implementing the specification create two implementations that will interoperate. By doing that, we have debugged the standard. We've debugged the text itself. The text must have been clear enough for both of you to implement and have it interoperate. So the running code is not about popularity, it's about clarity of standards. Not something that's immediately apparent. We have other RFCs, informational, experimental, historical. You can only tell the current status by looking at the index. Because we don't change the document once it's published as a proposed standard. It may be replaced by another version of the same thing as proposed standard. It may be updated to full standard. But you won't know that by looking at anything but the index. If you look at the document itself, the document was published, it says standards track. Doesn't tell you what level it's at, it doesn't tell you it's been superseded or declared historic because it turned out to be a really bad idea. We've got a few of those. You have to look at the index to tell that. The RFC editor is a function that publishes the RFCs. This used to be John Postel, an individual. And many of the early RFCs were done by him personally. He's lead editor on a number of them, and he ran the editor function for many years. He got a small team of people working with him. That function has now been taken over by the secretariat here. It's a few more people than just John. John's gone now, unfortunately. We ran an open RFP to get companies to bid on that process, and we've got a group right now, it's part of the secretariat that's doing it. So that's a separate function that's edits the documents, making sure they're readable and in the right format, and then publishes them. The RFC Production Center takes RFCs from internet drafts from various places and publishes them in RFCs. So that includes the IETF itself, the IESG, IAB, the IRTF, and an independent stream editor. We'll talk about that in a second. Yeah, the independent stream editor is next. John used to publish RFCs from people who sent him internet drafts to publish. When before we had the internet drafts, he published RFCs from text files. Because he felt that it was important to not have a filter, controlling filter of the IETF saying these are the only things that are allowed to be published. You want something where you come up with this great idea, you bring it to a working group and they say, nah, we don't like that idea. You still want to be able to publish that as an RFC. It won't be a standards RFC because standards track comes through the IETF, but you can publish it for information. Say, this is my idea and in 10 years I'll show you, you'll come back and want it. Whatever you want, however you want to do it, you can do that. So our independent stream is a safety valve on the process. It overcomes any kind of rejection that the IETF per se does. It also provides a venue where we can publish standards from other bodies, which we've done, or corporate documentation, which is not output of an IETF working group or IETF deliberative process. It's simply information for the community. So the independent stream editor takes care of all of that and also takes care of publishing the April Fool's Day RFCs. See, this is a pictorial for the IETF submissions on the RFC. So it goes from the working group or the individual to the ISG, last call to the internet, to the IETF community. If the ISG has concerns, it bounces it back to the working group. Otherwise, it pushes it off to the publication series. Non-IETF, which is the independent stream, goes from the individual to the independent stream editor. Independent stream editor has a review board that he uses to sound out whether this document is right for the IETF and right for the internet community. I mean, if you got a recipe for brownies, even if they're very special brownies, that's not something we're going to publish as an RFC. It's got to be technically relevant to the internet. The IAB and IRTF have their own ways to do this. So that's sort of the plumbing. So now, why are we here? What are we doing? What's our role? When I first started working in the IETF in the early 1990, the saying was above the wire and below the application. We didn't define wires and we didn't define what was on the screen. We defined the stuff in between that made it work. Well, it's getting a little harder to do that, particularly at the bottom layer. So what's a wire? Let's say Ethernet. Well, that's a nice thing, except we can now simulate Ethernet over IP. We can simulate frame relay over IP. We can simulate ATM over IP. We can simulate SONET over IP. So you can have IP over ATM, over SONET, over IP, over MPLS, over IP. So what's the wire anymore? So it gets a little fuzzy in that direction. It is also, because we're bottoms up, you come in and you have this great idea, you come in with a wonderful new protocol, let's say it's for streaming video of some kind, or let's say more pointedly, it's telephony. And it's a way that you can run cellular telephones from Wi-Fi base stations without modifying the cellular telephones. It's going to be a little hard to do, but let's say you come up with that. That steps on a number of different standards bodies. But if you bring it into the IETF and you got enough people liking it, we might move ahead with it, which is going to get really touchy in our relations with some of the other standards bodies. Some of the other standards bodies look at it and say, wait a second, you're stepping on our turf, and you shouldn't be doing that. But the other way is true too. Everything is moving to the internet. All telephony, all video stream, all video distribution, book distribution, everything's moving to the internet. Everything's bits, and everything's bits running over IP. That's just the way it is. That's not the way people thought it was going to be, but that's the way it is. So those traditional standards bodies that were, let's say, working in telephony, no longer have the field to themselves. They have this other upstart, the IETF, who is doing stuff in the same space, and doing it with a different philosophy. The IETF looks at it and says, what's the technically best way to do it? Many standards bodies look at it and says, what's the best way to preserve the business model of our constituents? And that's not generally a concern of the IETFs. It can be a real concern with some of the participants, but it's not a design goal to preserve the business model of an existing telephone system, for example. It can happen, but it's not a design goal. So other SDOs look at it and say, well, this internet thing, we can use that. We have to, because everybody else is going to. We're going to have to use it. But we could make it better by doing this. We can make it better for voice or better for video. We can make it different and make it better. One of the things about the Internet Protocol Suite is it's not very good for any one thing. It's designed to be flexible. It is not designed to be best. It's not the best way to do telephony. It's not the best way to do video. It's not even the best way to do books. It's a way you can do all of those things. So when a standards body whose only focus is on voice looks at the internet, they say, it's not good enough for voice. It's not high enough quality, or it's got too many gaps in it, or something like that. They want to improve it. So many of them have taken internet protocols and changed them on their own without understanding under the basis of it. And so we get in fights with other standards bodies from time to time about that. And this particular one with the ITU was pretty fierce for a number of years, where the ITU had taken MPLS, one of the IETF technologies, and modified it to make it better for transporting traditional telephony. And they did it in a way that we thought was broken. And plus the fact it wouldn't interoperate with what we've got. So we had a significant fight back and forth, all kinds of politics involved. In the end, it's resolved pretty well. We're now working together pretty well. And the IETF is responsible for modifying its own protocols. The ITU is not modifying our protocols anymore. But it was a hard time getting here. And it will happen again with other standards bodies. So here's the top level view of the whole constellation here. Stuff in green is the IETF, and the other stuff around it is around it. Internet Society is very important to us. The Internet Society was formed significantly after the IETF was. The Internet Society was formed in 1992. The IETF was formed in 1986. The Internet Society was formed to be the legal home for the IETF and to continue developing country workshops that a fellow named Larry Landweber had done. Very important things. Promote the open development, evolution, and use of the internet for the benefit of all people throughout the world. There's no goal there. I mean, that's as goals go, that's a pretty good goal. And explain it to the world. But the IETF looked at the Internet Society and said, huh, where'd you come from? And it wasn't until 1996 that the IETF, through a working group process, agreed to come under the legal umbrella. So it was a period of 4 years after the Internet Society was formed. The IETF just said, we don't care. You're offering us an umbrella we don't think we need. Well, then some rain happened, and there was reason to move it. But we went through delivered a process in a working group within the IETF to make the decision to come under the Internet Society's umbrella. And it's under the umbrella now. All the money goes through the Internet Society. It's the legal spokesperson. The legal spokesperson for the IETF is the Internet Society. The ISOC president is on the IAB calls, and although doesn't have any extra power there, as part of the word work there, the IAB is chartered by the Internet Society, and the Internet Society president picks the chair of the NOMCOM. So it's and the IETF picks board members for the Internet Society. It's definitely a worthwhile group to associate with. If you're interested, you can join as an individual. Your company can join. As an individual, you can do it for money or for free. For a company, you do it for money. But if your company is making money off the internet, you might want to think about it. It's a good thing. They support the IETF, the IETF's mission, plus they support the internet per se. IRTF is another thing that wasn't quite in that green bucket there, green section on the previous page. This is, at the time when the IETF was formed, the Internet Research Task Force was formed also. There were a number of other research groups at the same time. These are the only two that have survived. Research Task Force is looking at things that aren't ready for prime time. They're not ready for standardization. Like we had an anti-spam research group. We know we don't know how to do anti-spam, so that's research. Maybe someday it'll be something to actually standardize on, but there's not today. These are the research groups, the Crypto Forum, Delay-Tolerant Networking, though actually I think that's been moved. There's also a working group in that space. Congestion control, looking at the future. The bottom one is particularly interesting. Proposed Human Rights Protocol Considerations Research Group. This is to write up what are the kinds of things, if you're concerned with human rights, what are the kinds of things that you should or should not do in a protocol that would make it easier or harder for a despot government to invade human rights. It's very early. It's a proposed word. It's basically a BOF. It has not been chartered as a research group yet. They'll be meeting this week, and there might be some very interesting things in that. IRTF did a RFC a few years ago on privacy considerations on what you should do in your protocols to make them more privacy protecting. And this is more on the human rights, the area of free speech and the like.
IAB, I talked about the IAB already. It does the architecture guidance. It also does liaisons out to groups outside the IETF. So liaison to other standards development organizations formally done through them. The IAB does help review working group proposals and things like that. They undertake specific activities, these workshops. They also organize their work into these programs where it's trying to make it so that as IAB members turn over, you can still get these programs, these particular activities continuing on. There's a number of them you can look at under the IAB website on that. The IANA. The IANA is not part of the IETF, but we're dependent on it, but so are others. Used to be, once upon a time, very early on, it became clear that when you developed a standard for a protocol that runs over, in those days, the ARPANET, there's a field in that protocol, in the underlying protocol, it says 14 or 25. That tells the higher level protocols what application is being run here. It doesn't make any difference at all what that value is as long as everybody agrees on it. So you have to have a place that those are recorded. The Internet Assigned Numbers Authority was the place that it was recorded. That was a fellow named John Postel, the same John Postel that was doing the RFCs. He was the IANA. He individually was the IANA. He got some people to help him later on, but starting that he was the IANA. And he recorded what the protocol parameters were. 25 means email. 22 means SSH. He recorded those and put them in a little table. Then, a few years later, when we moved away from the NCP protocol over the ARPANET to TCP/IP, you needed somebody to record who had what IP addresses. So John took that up. So when it came time for Harvard to get some IP addresses, I sent an email to John and said, John, Harvard needs some IP addresses. And he sent me back mail saying, okay, Scott, 128.103.0.0/16, or Class B. So I got it from John. Then, a little later on, it was figured out that we don't really want to tell people to use IP addresses like don't send Scott mail at 128.103.8.36, which was the IP address of the computer on my desk in the psychology department for 20 years. You want to use a human-friendly name, a domain name, which can be translated into an IP address when it's needed to be. Somebody had to record who was running the name servers for those domains. So you had a root domain, and in there you had subdomains of .net, .org, .com, .fr, .us. Somebody had to run that little database to say what the IP addresses were for the name servers for those underlying subdomains. Yes, John did that too. John did all of those things. He developed a little group at ISI to do that. And then he decided he needed to spring that out to the general world, not just be part of a US government-funded thing. It was more important. The internet was too big for that. So he proposed to what he called institutionalize it and came up with a proposal which has been adopted as ICANN, the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers. That function within ICANN, which is doing the protocol parameters, is being done at the request of the IETF through a memorandum of understanding. Every RFC has got to have an internet draft that's proposed to be an RFC. It has to have some section in there saying whether the IANA has to pay attention to this or not. Or do we have to assign parameters and things like that. The IETF is no longer dealing with a part of the IANA which deals with IP addresses or domain names. Those are done elsewhere. The regional registries deal with IP addresses and the domain name community deals with domain names. The IETF just deals with the underlying technology. So, IETF management, all volunteers. The IETF chair, area directors, working group chairs, document editors, IAB members, IAOC members, they're all volunteers. None of them are paid. Even their expenses are not paid by the IETF. They're paid for by the companies they work for or by themselves. It's not, we don't do anything which is which is supported from the IETF side. It's a lot of work. The area director job is between half and three-quarters time. Having been one for a long time, it certainly is. IAB job's third time. Chair is full-time. The last few chairs have been this is their job, is being the IETF chair. The companies I work for give them up to the IETF for that function for a number of years to perform that function because those companies think it's worthwhile. They either PR reasons, say, we got the chair, or because they just think the internet is that important. We do pay for the RFC publication. We do pay for the secretariat. Speaking of secretariat, they're the people in the purple shirts running around. The person who gave out the handouts to you as you came in works for the secretariat. And that was done in an RFP, and there's a company called AMS is the company that got the job. I mentioned the IASA. This is, well, I mentioned the IOC. The IASA is the IETF Administrative Support Activity, which basically that's the home for the IOC, which is worries about the IETF budgets and things like that. The budget actually goes to the Internet Society, but the IASA and the IOC produce that budget, propose that budget to the Internet Society. The Internet Society decides to funds it. Most of the money comes from meeting fees. Actually, from a very long time ago, people coming to IETF meetings paid some money. Starting in '94 or something like that, they started to pay money. The money they paid was more than enough to cover the cost of the meeting itself. So the fee you paid to come to this meeting is more than it costs to put on this meeting. It helps pay for the secretariat. It helps pay for the day-to-day operations of the IETF. So most of our money comes from that. A good chunk comes from the Internet Society. A third or so of the budget comes from the Internet Society. And that mostly comes from the PIR, the registry that runs .org, and from organizational memberships in the Internet Society, combination of those things. The IASA, just like the Internet Society, has no authority whatsoever over the technical standards process. They are providing the environment, they're providing the funding. They do not have any authority, nor they can affect in any way, shape, or form the technical process. The IASA includes the IETF Administrative Director, that's Ray. That's a picture of Ray right there. He is the one employee of the IETF directly, and he's actually a direct employee of the Internet Society, but he's assigned to the IETF. And then the IETF Administrative Oversight Committee, which is an 8-member body. I'm on it right at the moment, but it's there. It's one of these dots here, the purple dot. That includes the IETF, some positional roles like the IETF and IAB chairs and the Internet Society president, and then people that are selected by the IAB, the IESG, and the Internet Society board. Then there's the IETF Trust. A lot of organizations here to keep track of, but the IETF Trust is the place where any intellectual property rights the IETF accrues, like RFCs themselves, the rights to those are put in the trust. Any code that the IETF contracts for gets put into the rights to that is put into the trust. The trademark, the domain names, all of those things are put into the IETF Trust. It is not a patent pool. It is simply a place to hold intellectual property rights. And you can, and all of the trust documents are public, of course. So how do we select the members of the ISG, the IAB, the IOC, et cetera? Well, we do it with participation from the community. We don't vote because we don't have any way of knowing what the constituency is. So what we do is ask for volunteers from the community to form a nominations committee. It's called nominations, but it's a little stronger than that, so it's more of a selection committee. If you volunteer, well, you can't yet. You have to have actually been to 3 of the last 5 face-to-face meetings in order to be able to be qualified to be authorized to volunteer for the nominations committee. But take all of the nominees in the nominations that volunteered, select 10 of them to form a nominations committee, a chair that's selected by the IETF, the Internet Society president, and they go off and they figure out who should be taking these roles. They're not the final say, but they're the semifinal say. Once upon a time, the early selection process was the names of the volunteers were written on little pieces of paper and dropped into a hat and taken to a local priest who then picked out the members of the committee. But that was deemed as, I don't know, biasable or something. We have an IETF member who decided that that was simply not good enough and came up with an RFC, and this is the latest iteration of it, 3797, which is way over the top, but it's sort of indicative of the quality work, though. What you do if you're with the NOMCOM chair is you say, on July 7th, I'm going to pick these people. So on July 7th, I'm going to take the quantity of stocks sold on these 9 stocks and the value, the digit string from this lottery, and I'm going to put all of those things together and create a seed for a random number generator. There ain't no way to bias that. And you use that random number generator to pick out of the volunteer pool. It's way over the top, but it does the job. It gets it done. And that's the IETF chair, the IESG members, or the area directors, in other words, IAB members, and the IOC members. And each one of this is approved by a higher level body, so that the IESG nominees are approved by the IAB. The IAB nominees are approved by the Internet Society Board of Trustees. The chair, I think, chair is approved by the IAB. So it's and yes, those bodies can reject one or more members of that slate, and it has happened. Usually because somebody in the confirming body knows something that the nominations committee didn't know, and they send it back for more work. See dots? There's one that's missing. The dots, the color dots on people's badges indicate activities. IAB members is red, the ISG is yellow, etc. I'm missing teal, which is the RFC editor group. I've got a blue dot as a working group co-chair and a purple dot as an IAOC member. There's the smiley face here, which is people who have signed up to be nice. Most people are nice, but these people have signed up to be nice. So if you ask questions of somebody with a smiley, then if you don't get smileys back, then there's something wrong. They shouldn't have signed up. We have an appeals process. We have to have an appeals process. That's just part of the rule set. If you're a standards body, you have to have an appeals process. Because if you bring in your technology and the working group chair says, nah, so we'll use somebody else's, you can say, but the consensus was with me. And you can appeal that decision. Any decision from the working group chair on up, you can appeal. Now, it's not a vacuous thing. There's not that many appeals, but of the appeals there have been, somewhere between a quarter and a third have been successful, where the ISG or working group chair has been told they did the wrong thing, and they have to go redo it. So it's a worthwhile thing to do if you feel wronged. Well, I hope you don't feel wronged on your first meeting. That would be sad. So let's try not do that. But the appeals process is there. Only if the appeal is of the process itself. You think that the mechanism by which the IETF functions, the standards, the document RFC 2026 and the other documents, which is the process documents, if you think those are flawed in some way that can be appealed to the Internet Society Board of Trustees, that's never happened. It's always stopped at the IAB, where the IAB says, yep, that's your appeal is correct, or nope, it's not. You will hear applause when if the IAB announces that there have not been appeals. That's an applause situation. That's a good thing. But we've had appeals. We've had appeals for actions. We had appeals for non-actions. The appeal was that the ISG did not decide about a document that they've been in front of them for months. That sort of thing. Intellectual property rights is the last big topic I'm going to talk about. It's a big area. There's 2 different subcomponents. One's copyright and the other is patents. Copyrights is pretty straightforward. You write that pinochle playing protocol, our internet draft. When you publish that internet draft, you are giving the IETF permission to publish the draft. Logical. Otherwise, why send it to us? If you're not going to give us permission to publish it, then it doesn't make any sense. You wouldn't have sent it. But you also give us permission to publish it as an RFC, unless you explicitly say you can't do that, and there's a mechanism by which you say that. And you give us permission to modify it within the IETF standards process. In fact, you give us permission to have it modified anywhere, but it's only within the IETF standards process that we exercise that. Those are the things you give us: an unrevocable right to publish and an unrevocable right to use it in the standards process, unless you specifically disclaim that. Once you've done that, though, it's yours. You can take that protocol and turn it into the Great American or Great Swahili novel, and that's just fine. You can take it to a different standards body, and that's just fine. You retain all rights other than the non-exclusive publication rights and modification rights you give to the IETF. They're all yours. So we're not, some standards bodies require you to hand over full copyright to the standards body. We don't do that. It's a little confusing sometimes, but you can go off and do anything you want with it. Patent rights are a little harder. Patents are a real bane to most standards bodies. The worst case scenario is somebody's in that standards body watching the progress of a standard, directing that process in such a way that the resulting standard overlaps one of their patents, and they don't tell you about it. This has happened. It's happened in the IETF. It's happened elsewhere. It's happened many other places, more frequently elsewhere than in the IETF, but it has happened here. That's called a submarine patent. And what happens is when the standard gets published, people start implementing it, and then sometime down the road, they start getting sued for implementing the standard. And that's a really ugly thing. So we want to avoid that. So we have a disclosure requirement. If you put in an internet draft that has something in it that, if implemented, would infringe your patent, by your here, I mean a patent that you own personally, or that your company that's sponsoring you owns, or at least can benefit from. So you may have a license to use this patent, a license to sue over the patent. If you've got any of those things, then you must disclose the fact that you've got the patent when you put in the internet draft. That's the first thing. Second thing is, if you're sitting in a working group and you see somebody else put in an internet draft that has your intellectual property rights in it, a patent that you have in it, and you participate in any way in the activity of that working group, then you must disclose the fact you've got the patent. We wrote it just that way so that if you're in the room and you see that somebody else has put in an internet draft that has your patented material in there, or more particularly, has material in it from a patent application, and your company does not let you talk about patent applications, you can just remain silent, don't do anything, don't talk to anybody, don't participate in the activities of the working group, and you're okay. But if you do anything that would push that technology one way or the other, either for your patent or against your patent, then you have to tell us about it. And then the working group, it's up to the working group to decide what to do with that. We specifically do not have the rule that we can't standardize something that has patents. We decided not to invoke that rule. There are other groups like W3C which have such rules. We do not. We leave it up to the working group. There are working groups where every single proposed technology to cover a particular problem has a patent on it. The robust header compression for IP over cell phones, every technology had a patent on it. So the working group can look at it and decide the technology is important enough that we're going to pick one of these things and we're going to move with it. Or the working group can look at it and say, nah, it's not that important. We'll just drop it. But it's up to the working group. We let the working group think about it and decide it. Note well. When you signed up to come to this meeting, you saw what was called the Note Well note. And this is a note that a couple lawyers and I wrote back late 90s. It's been distorted from its original purpose. The original purpose was to tell you what a contribution was. You must disclose any IPR that's in a contribution. And what is a contribution? And that's what the note well note says. If you send in an internet draft, if you speak at a microphone, if you send a message on the mailing list, if you do anything in an IETF meeting or an IETF venue, including a mailing list, which is designed to affect the outcome of deliberation, that's a contribution. And if you have such a contribution and you have intellectual property rights, patents, then you must disclose the IPR. That's what the note well note says. There's a mentoring program. If you want to be a mentoree, you contact the mentoring program. The IETF regulars will take you under their wing and help you see what's going on. I'm told this is a remarkably effective solution, that this works remarkably well. There are other tutorials today. You're in the first one, so you're not in the second one, because it happens at the same time. There's a Yang advice, that's a language for writing management standards for management protocols for configuring routers and things like that is a Yang. There's a transport area overview starting at 3 o'clock. There's a document, instructions on writing RFCs in internet drafts in this new markup language. If you don't want to use what I use as the old ASCII-based thing, if you want to use the new mechanisms, there's ways they use an instruction tool for that. At 4 o'clock, there's a meet and greet for the newcomers, you guys, with the area directors and the working group chairs, so you can get to know them. And if you have any particular interest, this table's set up with flagpoles on it saying applications area and a routing area, and you can go to there, and if you have a particular topic you're interested in, you go to there and capture one of the area directors or working group chairs in that area and talk to them about what you're interested in. Then there's a welcome reception. There is a optional newcomers dinner. There's an informal dinner to chat about what your experience is to date. Of course, that's Monday afternoon, so your experience is limited, but you're welcome to do it. If you want to do that, then you should send mail to Maddie at that email address and say you'd like to come. They'll be meeting at the IETF registration desk at 7:30 and wandering over to some local reasonably priced restaurant. What's next? You're here. Give us the benefit of your knowledge, your insight. Join mailing lists, go talk, read the documents, understand what's going on, comment on them, help us. Become part of us. Become part of making this internet better. Don't settle for second-rate stuff. Make sure we're doing the right thing. Make sure we're making the best possible technologies. And finally, this is not in your handouts, because I was told about it about an hour before the session. They've now set up a doodle poll or a survey monkey poll asking you what you thought of this session. They can do that after each of the tutorials. So that's surveymonkey/s/92 newcomers. And it's a little five question survey where they're asking you, what do you thought? And with that, do you have any questions? If you have questions, there's a microphone. Going once? Yep, here's somebody.
Richard Hansen, BBN. Why are there two
That's a good start. You got your name.
BBN. Why are there two microphones?
It's usually just to split the audience up because people don't want to come down to the front. The microphone is used in two ways. One is so everybody can hear you, and the other is actually a pacing mechanism, so that we don't have everybody talking at once. If you didn't have the microphones and people would talk to each other across the room, with the microphones, you get them up there, and then the chair will say front mic, front mic, back mic, in order to try and pace the discussion and to focus it. Any other? No? Closer to the mic.
You did mention that.
Well, you can pretend the mic's on.
You did mention that for certain types of documents, code has to be written. And the purpose of that code is to say this is popular, but to ensure interoperability. Does the IETF specify how You mentioned that before.
That's a very good question. That's very the question is whether we have specify how to measure interoperability. Not particularly. There's a lot of documentation of how people have done in the past. The original concept is that you should check each one of the features of the specification to be sure that it was implemented and it interoperates. And in fact, you're supposed to remove any feature which was not implemented or does not interoperate before you move the technology along. So, for example, we had OSPF is a routing protocol, and the first version of OSPF had 7 different priorities. Only one company ever implemented the priorities. So when OSPF moved along the standards track, the different priorities were removed. So it's all one priority now. But that was done pretty much, the individual who decided who was going to shepherd this says, okay, here's a list of functions, and let's see who implements these, and do they interoperate? And it's just really a brute force method, very much driven by the individual doing that checking. So we don't have any particular cookbook.
In other words, there's someone who shepherds the whole process.
Yes, there's somebody who is asserting that the conditions are met. Yeah, you should say your name again. Just Any other questions? Well, then, yep. How do we?
How do we interact with the OpenNet Foundation and with
The OpenNet Foundation, that would be a question for the IAB. I don't recognize that we have a liaison with them, but it's a question for the IAB. And so the IAB will be microphone for them, an open mic session for them on tomorrow evening, and you could ask that there. Okay, well, I think we're supposed to vacate the room about now, so thank you all.